Hi, gentlemen. So, insulin. Insulin is the one anabolic hormone that you can manipulate however you choose. So, we can choose to upregulate insulin and augment its concentration, or downregulate insulin and lower its levels. And it's simply done by nutrition. Insulin is the one anabolic hormone that you can affect like that. And that's really good because insulin is actually one of the best anabolic hormones. And one thing that always has held back insulin in terms of its place on the anabolic ladder, if you say, or if you want to call it that way, is that insulin doesn't actually do that much for protein synthesis. So if you have high levels of insulin, you cannot get any more protein synthesis, provided that you already have high levels of amino acids, especially essential amino acids, because the non-essential amino acids don't actually spark protein synthesis. But provided that you had a meal that contains a lot of essential amino acids, adding insulin to that doesn't actually augment protein synthesis. But the one thing that insulin does is that it lowers protein breakdown. So it lowers protein degradation, which means that you end up with a net positive balance, or a greater net positive balance of protein. And, well, that's for another video. But the thing that you can take away from insulin is that it's a very powerful anti-catabolic hormone from the protein calculation standpoint. But that's not what I want to talk to you about. Insulin, it is this magical hormone because it does a lot of what the more powerful anabolic hormones like testosterone does for the myogenic regulatory factors. So testosterone actually affects the MRFs, the myogenic regulatory factors, a lot, but so does insulin, and it does so in a good way. So high levels of insulin actually stimulate the insulin receptor, and below that insulin receptor we have the AKT and we have the PKC, the protein kinase C. Both of those actually regulate the myogenic regulatory factors like MyoD and MEF2, which is very, very crucial for hypertrophy. Very, very crucial. Remember, those regulatory factors, myogenic regulatory factors, they are transcription factors that bind to DNA, to specific sequences in DNA, and those sequences of genes are genes that allow for muscle growth. And by those transcription factors binding to DNA, they transcript more of that DNA, and the cell, the muscle fiber, can grow that much more and that much faster. Well, the one thing that insulin does is it actually allows the MyoD and MEF2, for example, to bind more effectively, a lot more effectively, to DNA. It's one thing for you to have a certain protein level of MyoD, for example. It's another thing for it to be active, for MyoD to actually couple with MEF2 and the P300, which are hats, but you don't know what that is. But they actually form an assembly that binds to DNA to transcript a lot more of that sequences of genes and a lot more efficiently. So insulin is this great hormone that allows the MRFs, the myogenic regulatory factors, to be that more efficient to allow you to grow. So high levels of insulin are really crucial for hypertrophy, and that is why people on, let's say, carnivore diets that don't eat carbohydrates, they typically don't get that big unless they are on steroids, right? Because steroids have these same effects that I just talked about. The other thing that insulin does is actually block some of the proteins that block acetylation of the chromatins. So if you know anything about biology, the DNA is bound to chromatins, which is wrapped around the chromatins, and that forms the chromosome. And the role of insulin is actually to block a lot of these enzymes that actually negate the possibility for acetylation, and the chromosome, the chromatin needs to be acetylated. That's a hard word to say. Acetylated for the gene transcription to be effective. If the DNA is wrapped around the chromosome, the chromatin, well, that's very hard for the transcription factor to bind to the DNA and for the DNA sequence to be read. So another thing that the insulin does is actually allow the DNA to unwrap itself from the chromatin, and for these transcription factors like MyoD and myogenin and MAF2 to be more effective at its job, which is to bind to DNA, read, transcript DNA, and allow those growth genes to be read, send out messenger RNA, and that messenger RNA can be translated into protein, which builds muscle. And finally, one of the things that insulin does also is it blocks or downregulates MRF4, which is the one myogenic regulatory factor that blocks hypertrophy. So typically the myogenic regulatory factors work to enhance hypertrophy by translating growth genes. The MRF4 myogenic regulatory factor is actually a regulatory factor or a transcription factor that blocks hypertrophy by blocking the acetylation process and blocking MAF2 specifically to bind to the DNA, to bind to the other regulatory factors. And the one thing, especially about the MAF2 actually enhances all of the other regulatory factors. So MyoD, myogenin can read a lot of growth genes, but if MAF2 effectively couples with MyoD and myogenin, they enhance the potential for MyoD, myogenin to translate even more effectively the growth genes. Well, MRF4 actually blocks MAF2, and that way it blocks a lot of the effectiveness of the myogenic regulatory factors. So I know we're getting a little bit complex, but never mind. For now, what you really need to know is that insulin plays a very important role in the hypertrophy game, and that's all. For now, I won't confuse you anymore. That's it, and I will see you in the next video. Hey fellow warrior, thank you for watching that, and if you liked that video, you would also like to know that I've made my workouts and meal plans completely available for free. All you need to do is go to my website, which the link will be in the description of this video, and pick your poison, whether if you want to gain muscle or looks fat and look completely shredded. You can pick whichever style of workout suits you better, and you can pick the meal plans according to your goals. Don't miss out on the opportunity, as for now they are completely free.